Today we will be talking about the urinary system. So urinary system is essential to make sure that blood is fine. For instance, it excretes various types of waste. It maintains fluid balance, making sure that the person is not overhydrated or underhydrated. It regulates the composition and the volume of blood, thus regulating the blood pressure. It also is responsible for the maintenance of the proper levels of red blood cells. In addition to these important functions of the urinary system regarding the blood, such as ionic composition of the blood and regulating the pH, it also can produce a vitamin, which is at the same time is a hormone, as we will see soon. It's a vitamin D, which is essential for the proper regulation of calcium levels. The importance of kidneys is underscored by the amount of blood flow that they receive. 25% of all the blood that is pumped through the body goes to the kidneys. Now, interestingly enough, kidneys filter about 180 liters every day, but only a small fraction of this 180 liters is actually excreted in the form of a urine. Urinary system consists of 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, urinary bladder, and the urethra. Now, kidneys are the size of the human fist. They're shaped like a bean, and they are positioned behind the back. You can see that the right kidney, right here, slightly lower than the left one because of the lever on the right. Kidneys are covered on the outside with a protective layer of fat and a connective tissue called renal capsule. Each kidney consists of the outer layer of cortex and the inner layer of medulla. Blood is supplied to the kidneys by the renal arteries, and blood is drained via renal veins. Renal arteries, renal veins, renal nerve, as well as lymphatic vessels, enter the kidney at the depression called hilum. Ureters pass through the hilum as well. Now, if you would look closer at the inner structure of the kidney, you will notice that there are so-called renal pyramids. So renal pyramids, essentially the structures in the medulla, they are formed by the collecting ducts of the elementary functional building blocks of a kidney called nephrons. So this pyramids is where the urine is formed. Urine drains from the renal pyramids and accumulates in the pelvis. So this is where the urine formed in the pyramids is collected and passed into. From the renal pelvis, the urine drains into the ureters. Urine contains various wastes, most importantly nitrogenous wastes like urea. And in general, all waste materials from urea to drugs leave the body by the urinary system. They are filtered out of the blood and then leave the body in the urine. Now, kidneys produce a couple of hormones. One of them is calcitriol, also known as the vitamin D. This vitamin helps to maintain proper levels of calcium in the blood. Another hormone, erythropoietin, is produced by the kidneys, and it stimulates the production of new red blood cells. Now let's talk about the blood flow through the kidneys. So the blood is supplied to the kidney via renal artery. Renal artery branches into segmental arteries that serve individual renal pyramids. Segmental arteries branch into the interlobular or interlobar arteries, which go between the renal pyramids through extensions of the cortex known as renal columns. Interlobular arteries branch further into arcuate, radiate artery, and eventually into afferent arterioles. Afferent arterioles deliver blood into glomerular capillaries for the filtration. Glomerular capillaries drain into the efferent arterioles. From efferent arterioles, blood goes into the peritubular capillaries, and from peritubular capillaries, blood through several steps through the cortical, radiate, arcuate goes into interlobar vein. Interlobar or interlobular veins merge into the segmental veins, and segmental veins merge, draining blood into the renal vein. The elementary functional unit, the kidney, is a nephron, shown on this picture. Nephron consists of a glomerulus, bunch of capillaries right here, a glomerular capsule, a proximal convoluted tube, a loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted loop or distal convoluted tube. Distal convoluted loop or distal convoluted tube go into the collecting duct. I want to highlight that collecting duct is not a part of a nephron. So glomerulus is it's a pretty knotted vessel formed by glomerular capillaries, and the blood goes into the glomerulus from the afferent arteriole. Now, once the blood passes the glomerulus, it gets into the efferent arteriole. In the meantime, the filtrate that is formed during filtration gets into the glomerular capsule. Now, efferent arteriole eventually delivers the blood into the peritubular capillaries or peritubular capillary network. They surround the entire nephron, proximal, distal convoluted tubules, and the nephron loop, and peritubular capillaries provide the link between the urinary and cardiovascular system. So essentially, the process that occurs in the glomerulus is filtration. That's when the wastes are removed from the blood into the filtrate. Another process that removes wastes from the blood is secretion that occurs mostly in the nephron loop and distal convoluted tubule. Now, some of the ions and nutrients that are filtered initially are returned to the back into the blood via the process called tubular reabsorption, which we're going to talk about later. So essentially, this is what happens during the glomerular filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Blood is filtered in the glomerulus, and the filtrate goes into the glomerular capsule. From the glomerular capsule, it goes into the proximal convoluted tubule, in the nephron loop, and in the distal convoluted tubule. While in this tubular structure, the processes of reabsorption and secretion occur, Reabsorption returns the small molecules back into the blood, and secretion gets rid of something that was not filtered in the beginning. So how does the filtration happen? We're going to get back to this in a second. Now I want to highlight one couple of important things. So loop of Henle here is along with the collecting duct. They are essential to remove the water from the filtrate and thus precisely regulate the fluid loss. Now, how is filtration happening? So filtration happens in the glomerulus. That's where urine formation begins. Now, urine is finally formed in the renal pelvis, but on the way to the renal pelvis, along with the filtration, it has to undergo reabsorption and secretion. So as the blood passes through the glomerulus, the nephron, the fluid is forced out of the capillaries and into the glomerular capsule. That is called a glomerular filtration. Everything from water to wastes to nutrients and salts are forced from the blood. And in order for the filtration to occur, the blood pressure in the capillaries should be high to force the fluid out of the blood. The fluid in the nephron, the fluid in these tubules, must have low pressure to allow for fluids to get into the tubules. And finally, the osmotic pressure of the blood in the peritubular capillaries should be high enough to draw back whatever is needed from the filtrate back into the capillaries from the nephron tubule. Now, during the filtration, fluid passes between so-called through the filtration slits, between the so-called food processes of the cells called podocytes. So here in this illustration you see two podocytes, and the food processes like this and this are crisscrossing, forming those filtration slits. Filtration slits are so small that only small molecules can pass through, small molecules like ions, water, glucose, and amino acids. Proteins in cells are too large and cannot pass through the filtration slits, and they stay in the blood. Now let's discuss how filtration actually happens and how pressures regulated. So first of all, the blood pressure in the glomerulus is high. This is because the diameter of afferent arteriole is bigger than the diameter of efferent arteriole, so that difference in diameters makes the blood pressure in those capillaries high. So there are three pressures that regulate the filtration in the glomerulus. Blood hydrostatic pressure, essentially a blood pressure. It forces the fluid into the capsule. Blood osmotic pressure, that is due to the levels, that depends on the levels of the protein albumin in the blood, draws the fluid back in the blood. And finally, capillary hydrostatic pressure, it forces the fluid back into the capillary. The sum of all those pressures give us so-called net filtration pressure that is directed from the capillary into the glomerular capsule. So the condition for the successful filtration is that blood hydrostatic pressure should be higher than the osmotic capillary pressure, and glomerular capsule capillary pressure, hydrostatic pressure taken together. So again, this total pressure in the blood that forces the fluid into the capsule is called a net filtration pressure. Now, what happens in the tubular reabsorption? In the tubular reabsorption, ions and water, I don't think it is on the picture, but ions and water, they return to the peritubular capillaries as the filtrate passes through the tubular system of a nephron. So ions and glucose move into the tubular epithelial cells from the filtrate by the secondary active transport. Ions and water move from tubular epithelial cells to the blood by the facilitated diffusion and by osmosis. Glucose specifically moves from the tubular epithelial cells to the blood right here by the facilitated diffusion. Now, finally, the secretion, the third process, in addition to filtration and reabsorption, is essential for removing the products that are too large to get filtered at the glomerulus. For instance, some drugs. Now, once the filtrate passes through the nephron and the collecting ducts, it reaches the renal pelvis. And in the renal pelvis, that's where the urine accumulates. Now, within the renal pelvis, water can still leave the urine, which makes urine more concentrated, which concentrates the salts in the urine, which may lead to the formation of the kidney stones. So these kidney stones can become large and can obstruct the renal flow, leading to an excruciating pain, and sometimes kidney stones have to be destroyed. It is usually done using ultrasound, so-called lithotripsy. From the renal pelvis, urine travels through the ureters to the urinary bladder, which is a hollow organ with a thick muscular walls covered with a transitional epithelium on the inside that is essential for ability of the urinary bladder to stretch. Now, when urine leaves the bladder, we call it urination or voiding or micturition. The micturition reflex involves both smooth and skeletal muscles, since the internal urethral sphincter that controls the passage of the urine from the urinary bladder to the urethra, is controlled by the autonomic nervous system and consists of smooth muscles, while the external urethral sphincter here consists of skeletal muscles and is controlled consciously. Now, from the urinary bladder, as we already mentioned, urine goes into the urethra. So in these illustrations, you can see transitional epithelium of the urinary bladder, and here you can see thick muscular walls of the ureter with a pretty small lumen. Now, urinary tract infections can occur when the bacteria from the outside of the body travels up the urethra and colonizes the bladder. Now, symptoms of urinary tract infection are painful urination. Often you can see blood in the urine, blood coming from the irritated bladder walls. This all are the symptoms of cystitis. So urinary tract infections have to be cleared by antibiotics, because if they are not cleared by antibiotics, the bacteria can travel up the ureters and infect the kidney, leading to pyelitis and pyelonephritis. It's important to remember that female urethra here is much shorter than the male urethra. So that is why women suffer UTI more frequently than males do. So inability to control the voiding is called incontinence. It happens across the population, but is more common in elderly women. Possible causes of incontinence include chronic urinary tract infections. Some medications can cause incontinence. Weakness of the muscles of the pelvic floor. In males, it can be enlarged prostate. Based on a stimulus, incontinence can be divided into stress incontinence, when somebody makes a physical effort and it leaks. Urge incontinence, inability to stop the urge to pee. And overflow incontinence, that's when the urinary bladder is so full that basically it overflows through the sphincters. Now let's talk about the water balance. So kidneys are crucial for maintaining the water and salt balance in the body and for removing the unwanted acidic and basic compounds from the blood. So excretion, filtration, and reabsorption keeps the volume of human blood at pretty much constant levels and the blood pH at about 7.4. Now, we mentioned before that kidney form 180 liters of filtrate, but we discharge only about 1.5 liters of urine. So urine is much more concentrated. It has a different osmolality than the blood. So how does that happen? So it turns out that as urine flows through the descending limb of the nephron loop, water is removed from the filtrate and urea is secreted into the filtrate. So that increases the concentration here of the filtrate and significantly decreases the volume. So at the bottom of the nephron loop, volume is much smaller than at the beginning, and the concentration is higher. Now, in the ascending limb of the nephron loop, sodium chloride is removed from the filtrate. Not only it, but mostly sodium chloride, which makes filtrate less concentrated. Now, this process of water reabsorption in the descending limb of a nephron loop is called obligatory reabsorption. It always happens. It is not really regulated. And reabsorption of sodium chloride is also not regulated here, and it actually is so efficient that the osmolality of the filtrate at the top of the nephron loop, basically filtrate in the collecting duct, is less concentrated than the blood plasma. So you see, that's the concentration of solids in the blood plasma, 300 milliosmoles per kilogram. And this is the concentration of the solids in the filtrate before it goes into the collecting duct, 100, so 3 times less. So you may ask, how is the urine concentration regulated if this process of water reabsorption is obligatory? It is regulated by the facultative water reabsorption in the collecting duct. This water reabsorption happens through the special channels called aquaporins, and it occurs by the means of a special enzyme called antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone regulates that water reabsorption in a collecting duct. The term diuretic means that this chemical increases the volume of urine produced. Antidiuretic means that the volume of the urine is going to decrease. So antidiuretic hormone decreases the volume of urine produced. So ADH, when it senses insufficient amount of water in the body, or decreased blood volume, or increased blood osmolality, essentially stimulates release of antidiuretic hormone. Now, antidiuretic hormone is secreted by the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and it increases the number of aquaporins. You can see it here. It increases the number of aquaporins in the epithelium of the collecting duct. So aquaporins are essential for removing water from the urine and return it into the blood. So in a nutshell, when someone is dehydrated, it both decreases the blood volume and increases blood osmolality. This stimulates the release of ADH, which increases the number of aquaporins, which removes more water from the urine, making urine more concentrated and less voluminous. So now we're going to talk about the balance of sodium and its role in blood pressure regulation. So when blood pressure is low, it stimulates the release of the hormone called renin. Renin activates angiotensinogen, converting it into angiotensin. Angiotensinogen is produced in the liver. So angiotensin 1 travels to the lungs, where it is converted to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 in turn spreads throughout the circulation and stimulates adrenal cortex to produce another hormone called aldosterone. Now, aldosterone has two effects, mostly on sodium and potassium. So aldosterone causes the excretion of potassium ions into the filtrate, so potassium leaves the body, while the sodium gets reabsorbed and retained in the body. So when sodium is reabsorbed, that also increases the reabsorption of water. So both sodium and water are drawn back into the blood. Now the two hormones that have an effect on the blood pressure are atrial natriuretic and brain natriuretic proteins. They both decrease blood volume and decrease blood pressure, and they do so by increasing the sodium and water excretion. So sodium and water leave the body, blood volume decreases, blood pressure decreases. Such drinks like caffeine and alcohol both serve as diuretics, so they increase urine production, most likely through the inhibition of the production of ADH. Now, antidiuretic hormone. Now, the blood pH has to be maintained in a pretty narrow range, 7.35 to 7.45 pH. This maintenance occurs mostly through the so-called bicarbonate buffer system that is formed by the means of respiratory system. So what happens in the kidney when it has to maintain the proper pH? The blood is too acidic, kidneys excrete hydrogen and retain bicarbonate, conserve bicarbonate in the blood. When the blood is too basic, they can return hydrogen back into the blood and spare bicarbonate. So this bicarbonate that's in the filtrate remains in the filtrate. Here in this illustration, you can see what happens in the respiratory system in case of acidosis and alkalosis. If somebody experiences acidosis, that increases respiration rate and gets rid of blood CO2 and increases pH. When someone experiences alkalosis, that decreases respiration rate and increases blood CO2, which means pH will go down. Now, urine is a valuable tool for clinical assessment. The analysis of urine is called urinalysis. It can reveal various serious diseases. So any unusual compounds in the blood can appear in the urine because urine is the byproduct of the filtered blood. So each of these compounds can manifest a specific problem. So if urine is darker than pale yellow deep amber, it means dehydration. In many cases, urine has a smell due to the consumption of specific foods or particular drugs. pH of the urine, abnormality with the pH may suggest acidosis or alkalosis. And high specific gravity of the urine also indicates dehydration. Now, presence of white blood cells in the urine suggests the urinary tract infection or kidney infection. Presence of protein, so-called proteinuria, reflects the blood pressure that is excessively high in the glomerulus, leading to the tears in the glomerular arterioles. Presence of ketones in the urine indicate state of ketosis, it most likely because of the diabetes. Presence of hemoglobin indicates that there is a bleeding in the upper urinary tract, and glucose in the urine indicates type 1 or type 2 diabetes mellitus. Now, there are several kidney diseases worth mentioning. Pyelitis, the infection of the renal pelvis, usually with the presence of pus. Bacteria go through the urinary tract, they migrate upwards, or they can get there from the blood. Pyelitis can be treated by antibiotics. Nephritis, shown here, swelling of the nephrons, which leads to dysfunctional kidneys. And glomerulonephritis occurs when renal blood circulation is blocked, so basically afferent or efferent arterioles are obstructed, clogged due to the atherosclerosis, for instance, or thrombosis, that leads to the swelling and shutdown of the nephrons. When nephrons are shut down, toxins and wastes build up in the blood. Blood volume, blood pH, blood composition are disturbed. That may lead to fatigue, dizziness, nausea, and if nothing is done about it, that can lead to death. Now, polycystic kidney disease shown on this photograph is the genetic disease when there are multiple cysts that are formed in the kidneys that destroys the normal kidney tissue. In severe cases of polycystic kidney disease, patient may require dialysis or a blood transplant. So what is dialysis? Dialysis essentially is exchange of the water-soluble substances through the membrane between two aqueous solutions. And so-called dialysis machines allow the dialysis to occur outside of the body. Here you can see a typical dialysis machine. So hemodialysis is dialysis that occurs between the blood and some other receptive fluid that is used to compensate for the lost kidney function. It can be done for an extended period of time, sometimes for years. People are on the dialysis if the donor kidney is not available. So blood is taken out of the blood vessel. It runs through the dialysis machine and eventually passes through the dialysis membrane inside of dialyzer. So toxins that are present in the blood, they diffuse into the solution, okay, and necessary plasma components cannot diffuse into the solution from the blood or even added to the blood by modifying the dialysis fluid. So dialysis fluid goes in, and then it is collected. So the main problem with the dialysis is that hemodialysis can lead to hemolysis, the breakdown of red blood cells, and breakdown of red blood cells can actually further damage the kidney and obstruct the blood vessels.